Hello, I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's streaming-only History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're working safely with the skeleton crew from our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. Remember that this Friday, March 5th, will be the Mississippi Historical Society's virtual annual meeting. Session titles are Mississippi as Architectural Trendsetter, Student Activism in the Civil Rights Movement, and Resistance and Memory, Free and Enslaved Laborers in Mississippi. The conference is free. We do ask that you register in advance, which you may do at mississippihistory.org. Then, join us for another virtual program on Saturday, March 6th at 11 a.m., when Frank Figgers and Hezekiah Watkins will discuss their experiences of the Mississippi Freedom Movement through images from the special exhibit, I Am a Man, Civil Rights Photographs in the American South, 1960 to 1970. Find details on the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum Facebook page. The Mississippi Department of Archives and History's partnership with the Community Foundation for Mississippi has allowed us to develop a new podcast titled Speaking of Mississippi. The first 3 episodes are online now and feature interviews with Deanne Stevens on the 1878 yellow fever epidemic, Jim Woodrick on the Civil War siege of Jackson, and Randall Kennedy on the desegregation of the capital city's public swimming pools. Each week, we'll post new episodes of Speaking of Mississippi, which you can find wherever you get your podcasts. Finally, I hope you'll join us next week for History is Lunch, when University Press of Mississippi author Michael J. Goldman will present History and Mississippi's Lost Cause. Today, we are happy to welcome Thomas Aiello to discuss the Scott Newspaper Syndicate and the Black Press in Mississippi. Thomas Aiello holds a BA from Henderson State University, an MA from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, a PhD from the University of Arkansas in United States history, and a PhD from the University of Exeter in anthrozoology. He is professor of history and African American studies at Valdosta State University and the author of nearly 20 books and dozens of peer-reviewed journal articles. Tom will join us via Zoom from Georgia, then we'll cue his pre-recorded presentation. When that's over, we'll bring him back on for a live question and answer session. You can ask your questions of Tom in the comments on this live stream, and I'll pass those along to him at the appropriate time. Now, here is Tom Aiello.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. And I'm happy that everyone could join us here today. My presentation today is about the Scott Newspaper Syndicate in Mississippi. Now, of course, the dean of the history of Black newspapers in Mississippi is Julius Eric Thompson, and this is by no way interfering with the great work that he has done. Instead, this paper deals with a very specific set of newspapers that were run out of a syndicate from Atlanta based off of the Atlanta Daily World, who tried to put a footprint in Mississippi by creating a series of papers so that they could help influence policy in the state. And so in a time like this, when having alternative presses, especially the Black press, speak up for minority voices, it is, I think, instructive for us to look back on how those minority voices presented themselves earlier in the century. And so this paper deals with the period between the early 1930s through the early 1950s, in the generation before the Civil Rights Movement, to see how the foundations of that movement developed, the intellectual foundations of that movement developed in the way that information was spread, and that was through the newspapers. That was how people got their ideas. And so this helps us track how the civil rights activists in Mississippi got their intellectual base in the generation before it started. And so if we can start the presentation, I will happily answer any questions that anyone has at its conclusion. Thank you so much. In the summer of 1928, William Alexander Scott began a small 4-page weekly with the help of his brother Cornelius. In 1930, his Atlanta World became a semi-weekly, and the following year, W.A. began to implement his vision for a massive newspaper chain based out of Atlanta, the Southern Newspaper Syndicate. Advertisements proclaimed, "Negroes are different in Dixie." In April 1931, the World became a tri-weekly, along with several of the syndicate companion papers. Among them, the Birmingham World, the Memphis World. Finally, in March of 1932, the Atlanta World became a daily. When the syndicate's reach began drifting beyond the bounds of the South in 1933, Scott changed its name to the Scott Newspaper Syndicate. In the generation that followed, the syndicate helped formalize knowledge among the African American population in the South. Black Southern newspaper reporting and the subsequent interpretation of that news had been largely the same. The Negro press, as sociologist Lincoln Blakeney explained, is the foundation of the Negro citizen's social thinking. And the only way to understand that thinking is to first understand the systematic dissemination of information through the region. And that dissemination was principally the project of the SNS. From the period March 1931 to March 1955, there were no less than 241 newspapers associated with the syndicate. The earliest example in Mississippi was the Jackson World. W.A. Scott was intimately connected to the founding of the Jackson World, as the paper was founded in the state which is the birthplace of Mr. Scott. He also received much of his education at Jackson College. Scott created the Jackson World Publishing Company to run the operation and hired a local, E.W. Banks, to edit the paper. It is ideally located, the syndicate boasted, in a state devoid of Negro newspapers. That was undoubtedly true. The roar of the roaring 1920s didn't really reach Black Mississippi. But the Depression of the 1930s certainly did, only eroding a black press that was already struggling. Only 33 black periodicals existed in Mississippi in the decade. Only 15 of them commercial presses, most housed in Jackson. It was a vast decline. In the 1890s, there were 46 black periodicals. In the 1910s, there were 66. Most Black Mississippi editors did not seriously examine issues of segregation, lynching, voting rights, due largely to intimidation and the violent consequences that might befall them. Still, papers carried plenty of reprints and wire stories that made those issues crystal clear. It was almost as if, though the Mississippi papers were printing the news, if the story was written elsewhere, or if the reported event took place elsewhere, their hands were clean. Such was the fundamental principle of what I'll call practical radicalism, arguing on the fringes of racial hegemony, picking their spots, urging local compromise, and saving their loudest vitriol for tyranny that wasn't local and thus left no stake in the game for would-be white saboteurs. To be black and Southern in those perilous times and to stake out a position at variance with the canons of segregation and white supremacy, explains historian John Egerton, required a mixture of conservatism and tactful independence that few non-Southerners could understand or appreciate. Patience and diplomacy and flank-covering caution were essential to survival. It ensured that papers provided clarity on the race issues that mattered to readers without creating coverage that could result in retributive violence from angry whites. Nell Irvin Painter argues that the two characteristics of the black press most clearly definitive of the difference between it and its white counterpart are a racial orientation
as opposed to a partisan orientation, and a sense of supranational racial identity, exemplified by coverage of the West Indies and of Africa. Small-town Southern black weeklies, however, often went against the painter model of the black press. The Southern Advocate, for example, founded in 1933 in Mound Bayou, was a 4-page paper that emphasized religious issues and the goings-on of area churches, along with printing local social and entertainment news, and some state news. There was little coverage of national or international politics. There was little of Painter's supranational identity. In early 1934, the Syndicate was involved in another push to expand its range by creating a series of world papers in Mississippi. The Mississippi World, for example, was published in Natchez by local Douglas W. Mosique. The paper's syndicated coverage included the doings of Natchez College, a historically black junior college that would later be made famous by Ann Moody, who attended the school in the early 1960s before moving on to Tougaloo and fame as an activist. There was also the near-requisite crime and murder coverage. A boy was killed for the 85 cents in his pocket. Another man was beaten and shot during a fight. It was the kind of scandalous coverage that Syndicate readers would always stop to read, whether in Natchez or in the range of other world papers created in 1934. There was also the Meridian, Mississippi Weekly Echo, which was, according to its masthead, a home paper with a home editor that tells the state news weekly. It was Mississippi's standard Negro newspaper of character, circulation, and opinion, with more than 10,000 readers. Its editor and business manager was Roy L. Young, who employed an assistant editor and a circulation manager in a small operation. An editorial from one late July edition began by noting the constant bemoaning of the delinquency of our Negro youth. But instead of following the script of the well-worn black Southern Jeremiad, it placed the blame for such problems, at least in part, on the conditions of our city schools. The primary schools were severely underfunded, but the one high school in Meridian was even worse, a condition of congestion that should not be associated with human beings exists in the building, the paper claimed. Most of the editorials, however, didn't stray from that time-worn formula. The next week, for example, the lead editorial was an extended disquisition on the virtues of home. Another editorial encouraged its readers in the face of difficult economic times. I believe if we cut out the D-E and the I of depression and use the rest of the letters, which will be press on, conditions will be better for all of us. So while much of the Echo's content was relatively religious and non-controversial, the paper did cover the murder of 7 black firemen for the Illinois Central Railroad by white men attempting to scare workers off the job so that their places could be filled by unemployed and needy whites. It covered the NAACP probes of virtual slavery in flood control camps on the Mississippi River. When 3 Rome, Georgia policemen killed a man and wounded another in a dice game raid, the paper covered the story in detail. But its editorial on the subject emphasized that the curative to such ills was to turn to God. It emphasized that the Negro has always been humble and submissive, and tried to make the case that all that the Negro possesses has come to him because of his willingness to bow. It was precisely the type of message that the black Southern press was pilloried for sending. Howard Thompson's Corinthian Gazette was similar, if on a slightly smaller scale. Its circulation was roughly 300. Servicing Corinth, Mississippi, and its surrounds. One representative editorial, for example, complained about Negro voting in the town. when a local white politician claimed that there are such few Negroes who are interested in who governs them, while the majority can be bought for a pint of whiskey. The paper responded not by denouncing white political rhetoric, but instead by using the insult to encourage better black behavior. Practically all Negro citizens pay some kind of tax, the paper stated, but very few pay poll tax. There are numbers of Negroes who know what to vote for, but no one knows it, because their only conversations are based upon which is the fastest car, a Ford, Chevrolet, or Pontiac. The paper hoped to, quote, see if we can't vote by showing to candidates that we are governed by sound doctrine, talk business instead of frivolous things, support our leaders, and quit kicking against them. The black citizens of Corinth needed to establish more business enterprises. They needed to save money and invest it. Buy us some homes instead of automobiles. In short, try to get some capital. The whole world will recognize money. It was a distinctly Washingtonian flourish, as in Booker T. Washington. Black voters needed to pay poll taxes, stop concerning themselves with the things they enjoyed, earn money, and quit kicking against white leaders so that their impression of Black Corinth would improve. It was a decidedly different message than what was coming from the paper's northern counterparts, from larger papers like the Chicago Defender or the Pittsburgh Courier. When the Gazette reported on a local car crash between a white driver and a black driver, for example, it noted that the white driver was at fault, but the black driver received the citation from white officers. No one believes that justice was done in the case, the paper admitted, but it approvingly reported that the black driver did not try to resist anything that happened. He took everything with a smile. Its coverage closed by bragging, it was the quietest case between a white and a colored that has ever happened in the South. It was problematic coverage, to be sure. Other contemporary syndicate papers like the Vicksburg Tribune and the Meridian Progress and Greenville's Delta Leader provided similar messaging. Founded in 1929, the Leader celebrated black achievements and worried over black causes for black problems. There was no emphasis whatever on black political participation, voting. Unions and labor movements were considered anti-American, problematic entities that blacks would do best to avoid. The Leader argued, in all things that are purely social, we can be separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. A direct quote from Booker T. Washington. But that Tuskegee model only worked if black Southerners stayed in the South. Mississippi papers, as a general rule, sought to keep black residents in the state, arguing that African Americans were a Southern people who belonged outside of northern urban hubs like Chicago or Detroit. The most important Mississippi S&S edition in the early 1940s, however, was the Jackson Advocate, headquartered in the state capital. The Advocate, under the leadership of editor Percy Green, hewed to the same Washingtonian line as the Leader, but did make room in its pages for a decidedly Southern version of activism. In June 1941, the paper reported on efforts of black World War I veterans to join the Mississippi Department of the American Legion. Green himself was among the veteran petitioners. Green was born in 1898, a native of Jackson who developed in an age of Jim Crow, when Booker Washington was the model of black Southern activism. He graduated from high school and then took some college classes at Jackson College before migrating north to various points in the Midwest, before then serving in the First World War. After his honorable discharge, Green returned to Jackson and fell into journalism not because of training or long-standing desire, but rather because he had been barred by racism from other options such as the law. He founded the Advocate in 1938, but allied it with the Scott Syndicate in 1940. In August 1941, Green explained in his paper that appointments for officers of the Agricultural Adjustment Administration in the state were all white. But with 52% of its population Negroes and largely a farming state, the paper reasoned one reaches the conclusion that a larger percent of the farmers in the state are Negroes. The black farmer also had less education and less opportunity, and thus was in much worse need of service and information to be given by these appointees. Sticking with the trajectory of practical radicalism, the Advocate didn't rail against the racist cronyism that created the appointments, or lament the bigotry that would fell the fortunes of black agricultural workers. Instead, it urged the appointment of some Negro field officer in the state to explain the AAA to Negro farmers, lest more than half the farmers of the state get something less than a second-hand idea of the meanings and benefits of the farm law. Green understood that he needn't engage in a quixotic attempt to gain an equal number of black AAA executives. By asking for one and explaining his reasons, the same stark point was made. In an extensive November 1941 editorial, the Advocate quoted heavily from the work of historian Herbert Agar, arguing that in comparison to the behavior of Nazis, we Americans have no grounds for pride in our general treatment of the Negro. The comparison was common but powerful. But Agar continued by qualifying that it would be even worse under the Germans. In a Hitlerized government, there would be no hope. The Advocate, however, sensed the overcompensation in such statements. With so much writing and speaking being done about the bad lot the Negro would fall into in a German-dominated world, the paper explained, we have begun to wonder if anyone has been able to discover any widespread and growing pro-Nazi attitude and sentiment on the part of the American Negro. The same month, the paper celebrated as 2 black convicted murderers were sent to the electric chair. They had murdered black victims, and the Advocate saw the verdicts as signs that white juries were beginning to take the loss of black life seriously. All throughout the state, the paper explained, all thinking, intelligent Negroes will commend and congratulate Judge Gines and the juries who heard the above trials. The paper hoped the case presages the beginning of a time in all the courts of the state when Negro murderers will be given the measure of punishment their crime deserves. In a state with so many established bigotries in place, the emphasis on convicting black criminals seemed a strange choice for the limited editorial space available to the paper. But it was a stand in favor of respect for black victims of crime that would not be generative of any white backlash. In March 1942, the paper reported on the annual meeting of the Mississippi Council of Interracial Cooperation. The group discussed the proposed creation of a school for delinquent Negro youth and the failed efforts of reformers to achieve the equalization of teachers' salaries, as had been achieved in other states. The plenary address was made by Jesse Daniel Ames, General Field Secretary of the Commission on Interracial Cooperation. Ames called upon the white people to learn more about the Negro by reading the Negro papers and magazines, to get a real understanding of their condition, which would in turn awaken them to greater efforts toward interracial tolerance. Ames was a vigorous and outspoken opponent of lynching, And in December 1942, the paper railed against lynching of two 14-year-old boys in Shibuya. The two had allegedly confessed to the attempted rape of a 13-year-old white girl. A mob took the boys from the jail and hung them from a railroad bridge where the supposed crime had taken place. The Advocate denounced the lynchings as by far the worst to have blotted the fair name of the state. Made particularly more egregious as Negroes are sending their sons to the armed forces and laboring to make the fullest contribution to the war effort on the home front. The paper lauded the state's governor for condemning the lynchings and claiming to work to apprehend those involved. It was a sound strategy that had been used by Southern newspapers for years. The editorial played to readers' patriotism and set itself on the side of the white Democrat governor in wanting justice for the action, giving it the white envelope it needed for the original denunciation. In another article, the Advocate described a meeting between the governor and a Negro delegation about an uptick in racial violence in the state. It quoted statements from Congressman John Rankin and Senator Theodore Bilbo denouncing the federal legislation to require poll taxes as a prerequisite for voting. Rankin claimed that the only way to deal with Negroes was either segregation or deportation, extermination, and amalgamation. The paper didn't directly attack the statements, but noted that Negroes of Mississippi are resentful towards the expressed feelings of the legislators. Combined with the lynchings, discrimination, segregation, they did foreshadow a dark and gloomy future for race relations in the state. In January of 1943, the paper reported on a federal grand jury indictment of 5 white men, one of them a deputy sheriff jailer, for the lynching of a Laurel farmhand who was also hanged from a bridge. The Advocate didn't provide editorial comment, but did include, even before the description of the charges, the opinion of several local white attorneys who had been quoted in the local white daily as saying that they regarded the action as an attempted federal invasion of states' rights. Such coverage in the local daily demonstrated the importance of the black press, whose simple, factual coverage of the indictment, using civil liberty statutes in the absence of a federal anti-lynch law, acted as its own counter to the biased coverage of its white counterpart. The trial of the lynchers was set for April, and the paper stuck with the story, explaining that maximum penalties under the civil liberty statutes provided a fine of not more than $5,000 and imprisonment for not more than 10 years. Howard Wash, the Laurel farmhand, had killed his employer in self-defense after being assaulted for arriving late to work, after a jury had convicted him of second-degree murder and sentenced him to life imprisonment. A mob of angry whites, dissatisfied that there wasn't a capital verdict, took matters into their own hands. It was obvious illegality, an easily proved lynching. But it was also a white Mississippi jury. The lynchers were acquitted after a brief one-day trial. At the same time that the Laurel indictment was coming down, however, the Advocate was using its editorial space to denounce A. Philip Randolph's March on Washington movement as revolutionary and radical, counterproductive in the face of an inevitable war. The paper admitted that Randolph's goal was to focus the attention of American people upon the violation of the basic human moral and citizenship rights of the Negro in this country. But despite that, hoped that the proposal of nonviolent civil disobedience by Mr. Randolph will be at once rejected by the rank and file of Negroes and Negro leaders throughout the country. The United States, the advocate argued, was not India and needed no Gandhian approach to securing its rights. In a democracy, there were better, safer ways to earn rights and respect. It was the kind of editorial that gave Southern journalism its reputation for cowing to white domination. But at the same time, it provided the paper a national foil to demonstrate its patriotism and ultimately bolster efforts at earning rights at home in Mississippi. Such was one of the cornerstones of practical radicalism, as was touting the successes of local citizens. A February 1943 editorial, for example, praised the success of Roddy Pridgett, a black farmer from Rankin County who had become the first Negro farmer in the United States to pay back in full a loan obtained from the Farm Security Administration, a full 36 years before final payment was due. The occasion allowed the paper to praise the FSA for the opportunities it provided black farmers. In the cotton-producing states, the sharecropper system and the system of farm tenancy that has developed along with the development of cotton farming is largely responsible for the widespread illiteracy, poverty, and general backwardness that led to the designation of the South in recent years as the nation's #1 economic problem, the paper reported. By helping sharecroppers escape that system, the FSA allowed them to escape many of the major evils of the sharecropper farm tenancy system. That month, British economist Sir William Beveridge spoke in Jackson, arguing, "The Negro is peculiarly suited to Southern agriculture, and particularly to the Mississippi Delta, and should be kept here rather than permitted to migrate to Detroit, Harlem, and others of the nation's industrial centers." Beveridge suggested improving black living conditions through better schools and homes as a carrot to curb migration. The advocate agreed that migration was hurting the economy of the South, but questioned Beveridge's knowledge of the region, frustrated that it had always seemed the very first remedy to be suggested is that of benevolent paternalism. Benevolent paternalism has been tried with the Negro, the paper argued, and it failed. And it would always fail, because of the limitation imposed by self-interest on the part of those who administer it. The only way to change conditions of Southern agriculture, and thus curb the Great Migration, lies, the paper argued, in the Negro being given the right to vote and the opportunity to shoulder the full burden of the duties and responsibilities of citizenship. We don't need handouts, the paper explained. We need to be given the rights and responsibilities of everyone else. Fair treatment would keep the black farmer in the South. But fair treatment would be hard in coming. Voting, for example, had always been the cause célèbre of the paper, and it reacted angrily and in detail in July 1944 when the Mississippi Democratic Party took advantage of its first opportunity to show the rest of the nation its disregard for the recent decision of the United States Supreme Court giving Negroes the right to vote in the Democratic primaries of the South. In other words, the white Mississippi Democratic Party was denying ballots to dozens of qualified black voters, even though the Supreme Court had ruled the white primary unconstitutional in 1944. Later that year, in December, the paper called disfranchisement the South's worst evil. It appreciated efforts to pass a law abolishing poll taxes. A widespread white rumor attributed Adam Clayton Powell with claiming that he would move to Mississippi and run for governor if the tax was abolished. The Advocate publicly doubted the attribution, rightly so, and called out the ruse that black voters would use the franchise in a block as a way to thwart efforts at the ballot. And thus, while appreciating the sentiment behind trying to remove the poll tax, the paper noted that the real and therefore more important impediment in the pathway of the Negro of the South towards the franchise and the right to vote is the right of comparatively insignificant public officials to determine the right and qualification of the Negro citizens to vote, even after having paid the required poll tax. The paper reminded its readers that working for the right to vote was to attack the problem on all fronts, not simply one ceremonial or representative issue. In April of 1946, the Advocate celebrated a new Supreme Court decision in Georgia that validated its original Texas decision in validating the white primary. A new age is being born, the paper suggested. No person who takes an honest look at the situation can fail to see that many of the worst conditions of the South exist primarily because of the fact that the Negro citizens of the South do not enjoy the right to vote. A real demonstration of democracy, it argued, would be that the powers that be in Mississippi, without waiting to face the inevitable decision of the United States Supreme Court, would set in motion the right of qualified Negro citizens of the state to vote in all elections, along with other citizens of the state. It was a bold call in the one political area, voting rights, upon which the paper was intransigent. And that bold call would pay dividends, proving that this kind of advocacy worked. One of the greatest victories for and in the name of democracy took place in Mississippi on Tuesday, July the 2nd, 1946, the paper reported, when for the first time in the state's history, Negro citizens voted unmolested and without incident in the state Democratic primary election. Theodore Bilbo had called on white Mississippians to resort to violence to keep Negroes from the polls. But no violence was reported, and black voters participated in the primary, which is tantamount to election. Still, the losses resonated more than the victories. In 1930s Mississippi, everything was segregated, and black schools, neighborhoods, and facilities were all unequivocally inferior to those of whites. From the 1880s to the 1930s, 463 black Mississippians had been lynched, more than 5 per every 10,000. The majority of black people in Mississippi were tenant farmers and sharecroppers, suffering the inevitable debt problems that came with such a position, ultimately leading to debtor's prison and the convict lease system and a virtual re-enslavement. There was also the attendant required social deference and unequal contact and communication between whites and blacks. It was a system that was so inherent to the thinking of white Mississippi that its governor, Governor Bilbo, published a book on the subject in 1946. Take your choice, separation or mongrelization. It had become, through the decades of constant use, through the false remembrances of the lost cause, and the inherent assumptions made daily about black inferiority, a way of life, the Southern way of life, which was in its essence a euphemism for the white Southern way of life. When combined with the dilapidated state of black education in Mississippi and the closed door to almost every instance of economic mobility, there was little room for black Mississippians to maneuver in making claims against the system. The system itself served to keep the dictates of the philosophy that undergirded it in place. a circular fallacy that became a self-fulfilling prophecy, and one from which it was nearly impossible to escape. It created a totalitarian system where criticism was tantamount to treason. Mississippi history textbooks featured nothing about black leaders, argued that Reconstruction was a corrupt disgrace, and gave the system an academic grounding, a historical grounding. The focus of the educations of white and black also remained different, as white Mississippi children were prepared for college, professional programs, and other opportunities. Black education was assumed to be wasted on those who would never reach such heights, and thus the self-fulfilling prophecy continued to spin its tautological wheel. The state had founded Alcorn A&M for potential black collegians, but it was an inadequate degree from a university that carried little weight. It was that situation, that overarching bigotry that enveloped the state, that led more than 1 million black residents to leave Mississippi between 1910 and 1960. Those still in the state, however, needed a paper that represented them. And the syndicate's Jackson banner made the attempt, reporting in the early 1950s on the pending execution of Willie McGee, 37-year-old father of 4 children, for an alleged rape he vehemently denied committing. The paper's coverage described the 3 convictions of McGee. The first overturned for a change of venue. The second because, quote, Negroes had been systematically excluded from the juries. The third conviction, however, had not been overturned, despite the efforts of a substantial legal team trying to secure his release. When a last-minute hearing for clemency was put to Governor Fielding Wright in early May 1951, police arrested 42 people demonstrating outside of the state capitol building in an effort to spare the life of McGee. The effort failed, however, and McGee was finally executed. Though the banner was clearly opposed to McGee's execution, it provided no editorial comment, simply describing the facts of the case and the efforts to save his life in the tradition of the grapevine telegraph. To do any more would be to curry the anger of White Jackson and more potential violence in response. In April 1951, after the regional coordinator for the NAACP announced that the organization was going to work to integrate Mississippi colleges, the state's Governor Wright vowed to keep Mississippi education segregated, regardless of cost or consequence. The banner reported on Wright's statement and printed much of it, but again did so without editorial comment. In June, the paper reported on the creation of the Negro Womanhood Defense Committee, formed to help raise funds for the prosecution of a local white man accused of raping a 14-year-old black girl. The group committed to raising $10,000 for the prosecution. The effort demonstrated the clear disparity in criminal justice standards in Mississippi, particularly after the execution the previous month of the probably innocent McGee. The paper limited itself to coverage of the rape and the defense committee, as it had done with the coverage of Fielding Wright, as it had done with Willie McGee. When denunciations weren't feasible, the banner was able to make its point by simply piling up basic evidence of rampant inequality. But the problems would continue to haunt. When the NAACP tried to capitalize on its post-Brown momentum by attempting to integrate 5 Mississippi school districts, for example, the white citizens' councils teamed with government officials and local outraged whites to stop the move. Both the white Jackson State Times and the Jackson Daily News took vigorous pro-council positions, defending the organization and encouraging membership. The white Yazoo City Herald ran a full-page ad submitted by the council. The desegregation effort failed largely because of the collusion of mainstream newspapers. The white press in Mississippi continued to support the councils, to charge the NAACP and similar rights organizations as tools of communism, and to validate segregation and racism with the legitimacy that comes with standard news coverage. And it was that kind of coverage that had been consistent from the 1930s through the early 1950s that made a black press voice in Mississippi from the 1930s to the 1950s so important. And the SNS, the Scott Newspaper Syndicate, allowed that to happen. To be sure, the black press in Mississippi from the 1930s to the early 1950s was not as radical as the Pittsburgh Courier or the New York Amsterdam News, the Chicago Defender, or other northern national newspapers. They didn't have that leeway. They didn't have the luxury of reporting on Southern atrocities from afar. They reported on them from within the belly of the beast. But creating that news outlet, creating that black voice within the South during the harshest decades of Jim Crow segregation was vital to creating the kind of momentum that was going to be necessary to create a civil rights movement in the 1950s. That movement doesn't happen without the formalizing of knowledge that comes with a syndicated black press that moves throughout the state and counters those white messages. The work of the syndicate and its members was vital to the development of black Mississippi in the 1930s through the 1950s, establishing the seedbed of what would become the informational base of the civil rights movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. That was great. We have lots of questions. Do you have a few minutes for us to work through some of them?
Absolutely.
All right. One of the first ones was a question about the ease of access to those newspapers today. Have they been collected, digitized? I see that some of them are available online, but in what quantities?
So, not a lot of them have survived. There are some Jackson Advocates still available, and of course, Jackson Advocate is still around. So it has survived the longest. The vast majority of these papers, however, were small, and they were created simply because the syndicate had a way to do it. What the syndicate did in Atlanta was they encouraged anyone who wanted to create a paper to write up local news, to do their own reporting, to send in whatever they wanted, collect advertising and send it in. And then in Atlanta, they would make the paper for them. They would add a bunch of other stuff from other papers that they owned, fill out the paper, and send it back. And so a lot of the people who are doing these papers are not journalists. They are teachers, or in some cases janitors. Just any kinds of professions that kind of became newspaper editors in their town because they knew of the importance of the black press. And because of that, and because white people controlled all the libraries that would save these kinds of things, the vast majority of them don't get saved. The way that I was able to track these papers was to use the cash receipt books of this newspaper syndicate, which are at Emory, and to find all these papers that otherwise have really left no trace. And so then what I did is I took all the names of those papers and I would go through the Atlanta Daily World, the main paper of the syndicate, and start carving out every dateline that had a dateline from that city. and then track it to a certain newspaper at a certain time to see where it came from. And that's how I'm able to collect various stories from these papers to be able to recreate their editorial positions and things like that. And then use kind of more archival work to go and find out about these individuals or who are creating them. Unfortunately, many of these papers simply don't survive.
Yeah.
The one exception to that, of course, being the Jackson Advocate, which does have some issues remaining.
Yeah. So were the newspapers sold and distributed mainly by subscription? Where were they sold in the neighborhoods and the towns?
Right, so that's a great question. They're sold in a couple of different ways. If you are in Jackson, subscriptions are available to both the Jackson World, the Jackson Advocate, and later the Jackson Banner. They all have subscriptions available. If you're in a smaller town like Corinth, the Corinthian Gazette is only going to be sold on the street. There aren't really kind of formal subscription policies, but there is a known audience for the papers. And so any given editor can order as many copies as he or she thinks they're going to need. So we know that if the Corinthian Gazette is ordering 300 papers a week, we know that even though there isn't really a subscription service for the Corinthian Gazette, that the editor is confident enough that he can still turn a profit and order and pay for 300 papers. And so we can assume that that's how that's working. We also know that the black press, unlike the white press, works on a tiered influence basis. So we can assume that every copy of a black newspaper, especially in small southern towns, typically go into more than one hand. So someone buys the paper and passes it on. So we usually assume that readership for each individual issue is at least 3 or 4. So we could say if the Corinthian Gazette had a circulation of about 300, then close to 1,000 people are getting access to that news every week, because it is a community effort in a place that has been kept artificially poor by Jim Crow.
Yeah. We have 2 questions from the comments of the live stream about photographs. I'm going to combine them here. Sarah Kimball asks, did the Jackson Advocate of those early years have a staff photographer? And then Deirdre Payne asks, what happened to Percy Green's photo files?
That's a good question. The Jackson Advocate was the only paper in Mississippi that was able to hire photographers. They did not have a staff photographer, but Percy Green did hire photographers at various times over the course of his tenure at the paper to commission photographs of various incidents that were happening in and around Jackson. Now, the paper did have plenty of photos in it of national things, but those were all provided in Atlanta. The local photos, though, were commissioned by Green. He could afford to do that. Most other papers could not. As far as an archive goes, Percy Green and the Jackson Advocate didn't leave his papers to an archive in particular. If you're looking for the photos of the Jackson Advocate, my best advice is that is the one of these papers that actually still exists. Mm-hmm. And so I haven't talked to the people who run the Jackson Advocate now. It is, I think, it's not only an online edition, but its main circulation is as an online edition. But if anyone still has the photos from the early days, from 38 forward when the Jackson Advocate starts, it will be them. They still exist. And so that would be my best guess as far as photos go.
Yeah. We had a question about what sort of advertising the Scott Newspaper Syndicate newspapers featured, and whether they were all equally profitable or unprofitable, or if it varied.
It varies. So There are some papers in the syndicate literally last less than a month. They only run a few issues and find that they cannot sustain. But then some, like The Advocate, last for decades, and others across the country who are part of the syndicate also last for extended periods of time. It really depends on the amount of advertising you can pull locally. What will end up happening is that the amount of content you send in will be added to other syndicate material that they put together to make a paper, including their own advertising, because they're making money off of this in Atlanta as well. So your profit derives from how many copies you can sell and how much of your own advertising you can send to Atlanta to have included in your paper. Most of the local advertising comes from local businesses who are interested in having a local Black outlet for the news and interpretation of that news in their city. But the papers are filled with advertising. Most of that comes nationally from Atlanta that collects from around the country. Those advertisements are, as you might expect from the Black press in the first half of the 20th century, there was a lot of, skin whiteners and hair straighteners, and the advertising is let's just say conservative at best when it comes to various forms of advertising, and there is a lot of advertising that would be interpreted by a modern readership as kind of self-defeating, if not self-hating. That certainly does exist, but it's important to note that those advertisements are placed from Atlanta. Nobody in Mississippi is soliciting those kinds of advertisements. They're selling to local businesses. All those other advertisements that we tend to see as a little bit more problematic are coming from the publisher itself and the printer.
We're almost to the end of our time here, but let me pass along one last question. The syndicate operated through some of the most violent and dangerous years of Jim Crow. Were any employees or offices ever attacked?
That's a great question. While we have tons of Black Southern newspaper offices attacked around the South, from Texas to North Carolina throughout this period, none of the syndicate papers ever received any direct violence. And that's largely a result of that practical radicalism that we talked about in the talk. They had a strategy for trying to counteract any kind of white resentment. Now later on, that's going to get them into trouble. Later on, the Atlanta Daily World is going to end up arguing that the sit-ins were a bad idea in 1960, and they're going to get a reputation for being overly conservative and accommodationist to white interests. While they're not being accommodationist in this period, they certainly understand the racial climate in which they find themselves. And so they use that practical radicalism strategy to be able to pick their spots, to criticize lynching and other acts of racial violence when they can, while avoiding any kind of commentary that would provide any locals with the kind of anger that might lead them to want to hurt the paper.
Yeah.
And they do that by commenting on lynchings from elsewhere. Or if they have to comment on local things, they use editorials from Atlanta with an Atlanta dateline to criticize local activities so that they have plausible deniability if any white people get mad at them. And so there's a very clear strategy for them on how to avoid the kinds of violence that we see at the fringes of the South, particularly in the two Carolinas and in Texas, that comes when papers are burned, paper offices are burned, and print shops are destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
We don't really see that with the syndicate.
Thank you. This has been great. I need to apologize to our viewers. The watermark for the department's logo in the bottom right-hand corner, I think, obscured Tom for most of the program, and we'll do better on that.
That's probably best for everyone.
Remember that the Historical Society's annual conference will be this Friday, free online, mississippihistory.org for information about that. Mr. Frank Figures and Hezekiah Watkins, Saturday, March 6th at 11 o'clock live-streamed event. You can check the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum's Facebook page for more information about that. The podcast, Speaking of Mississippi, available now. Tune back in next week for Michael Goldman, who will be talking about history in Mississippi's lost cause. But for now, thank you again, Tom, Aiello. This was great, and we look forward to having you back in the future.
Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. And if you have any other questions, you can find me online. Please get in touch. I'll be happy to help with anything else. Thank you so much.
Thank you.